Good evening, my nocturnal historians. Welcome to today's episode of Boring History for Sleep. I'm very glad you're here. Today, we will cautiously explore one of the most puzzling and oppressive chapters in human history, the Black Plague. Before we begin, I'd like to know where in the world you're listening to us from today. Feel free to leave a comment. Are you ready to settle in? Take a deep breath. Get comfortable, let the burden of the day melt away, and let us begin. It was the early 1340s, and medieval Europe was stable, at least by its own standards. Kingdoms feuded, peasants labored, and trade routes like veins stretched across the continent, carrying goods, ideas, and, unknowingly, future disaster. For the average villager in France or England, life remained much as it had for generations past, hard, predictable, and deeply tied to the land and the church. Most of the population lived in the countryside. The majority of people were peasants or serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. They lived in simple homes of wood or wattle and daub, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. The world of the family was small, the manor, the church, the fields, and the woods beyond them, a space that rarely extended beyond 10 miles in any direction. Daily life was defined by the seasons. Spring brought plowing and sowing. Summer meant tending the fields. Autumn was the time of harvest. Winter brought rest, hunger, and prayer. There was no electricity, no clock to wake you, only the rising sun and the tolling of the church bell. The diet was modest and repetitive. Bread was the staple, dark, made from rye or barley. Meat was rare for peasants. They relied on pottage, a stew of vegetables and grains, supplemented by eggs, cheese, onions, and ale. Salt was precious. Sugar was a luxury. Spices were mostly reserved for the nobility, who ate better and often lived longer, though not always. Clothing was functional. Most people wore wool. Linen was worn underneath to save the skin from the scratchy wool. The upper classes distinguished themselves with fur, embroidery, and fine tailoring. But for most, a single tunic might last for years, patched many times over. Trade was growing. Europe was not isolated thanks to the Pax Mongolica. Goods from the east, silk, spices, porcelain, flowed along the Silk Road into the mercantile cities of the Mediterranean. Genoa and Venice were powerful port cities. Constantinople, still alive under Byzantine rule, served as a gateway between worlds. Ships carried cloth, wine, wool, and grain across the sea. With them traveled sailors, rats, and unseen passengers who would soon devastate half the known world. Politically, tensions were brewing. The 100 Years' War between England and France had just begun in 1337. This was a backdrop of anxiety, but few believed it would touch them personally. War, like the weather, was something that happened over there. In the absence of modern science, there was no sense of a microbial threat. Illness was either an act of God or a mystery. There was no quarantine, no understanding of the role of rats or fleas. There were just the usual concerns. But beneath that normality, a storm was already forming. To understand how the Black Death arrived in Europe, one must first look east, to the shores of the Black Sea, to the tangled trade routes of the Silk Road, and to a place called Caffa, now Feudossia, a small port city in the Crimea. In the mid-14th century, Caffa was a vital artery in the vast system of international trade. Caffa was controlled by the Republic of Genoa, one of the foremost maritime powers of the time. It was a center of commerce, noisy, multilingual, and strategically placed between Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Mongol territories of the East. In 1346, Caffa found itself under siege. The attackers were the Golden Horde, the Mongol Ulus that ruled large parts of modern Russia and Central Asia. Relations between the Genoese traders and their Mongol counterparts had soured, leading to a brutal and prolonged military standoff. Then the disease arrived. It began inconspicuously. A few soldiers in the Mongol camps grew ill. High fever, strange swellings, death within days. Then it spread. Soon, whole ranks were decimated. Historians still debate the full truth of what happened next, but one version, retold by the chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, a notary in Piacenza, became legend. According to de Mussi, in a grim act of desperation and retribution, the Mongols catapulted the corpses of their infected dead over Caffa's city walls. Whether this early form of biological warfare actually occurred or was embellished by frightened observers remains unclear, but the results, regardless of the method, were the same. The disease entered the city. Once the disease was inside, it spread rapidly. The Genoese merchants, aware of the threat but not fully comprehending it, fled by ship, attempting to outrun the disease by sea. Their destination was the home ports, like Messina, Genoa, and Venice. They believed the wind would carry them to safety. Instead, it carried death. These Genoese ships became floating coffins. Accounts from the time describe sailors dying at sea, bodies thrown overboard, and ports refusing to accept ships out of fear of contamination. But fear in the 14th century was ungrounded. There was no germ theory, no understanding of contagion in the modern sense. Some believed the disease came from bad air, miasma, or the alignment of planets. Others saw it as divine punishment, a reckoning for sin. Yet despite the fear and the rumors, the ships docked. In October 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading vessels pulled into the port of Messina on the island of Sicily. According to contemporary sources, the ships arrived with most of their crews already dead or dying. The citizens of Messina, unaware of what was about to unfold, rushed to help. They carried the sick from the boats, buried the dead, and tended to the survivors. Within days, the disease began to spread throughout the city. The symptoms were terrifying by medieval standards. Victims developed blackened swellings, buboes around the groin, neck, and armpits. High fever followed. Many vomited blood. Death came quickly, often within 3 to 5 days. In some cases, people died within 24 hours of showing signs. The rumor spread quickly, but the disease spread faster, out of Messina. The plague moved outward, traveling on every available vessel. By January 1348, it had reached Genoa and Marseille. In Venice, where the Republic prided itself on order and record-keeping, the government took some of the first known measures of quarantine. Ships were held offshore and travelers were isolated. But even Venice could not stop the tide. The movement of the disease was not limited to ships. It traveled along trade routes, penetrating inland via caravans, carts, and roads, carried by fleas on rats that infested the holds, grain sacks, and storehouses. Rats were everywhere in 14th century Europe. No one suspected them. Within weeks of reaching the ports, the plague appeared in inland cities: Pisa, Florence, Toulon, Avignon, the city of the Pope himself. By mid-1348, it was in Paris. In 1349, it crossed the English Channel and arrived in London. It struck unevenly. Some cities were devastated, losing more than half their population. Others were mysteriously spared or suffered less. But few regions escaped it entirely. The ports that opened their doors to the world had unwittingly welcomed an invisible invader, one that would eventually claim the lives of an estimated 25 to 50 million people across Europe. Yet in 1347, when those first ships tied up in Sicily, there was still hope. As 1348 began,
The plague that had creeped ashore in Sicily was no longer an oddity confined to foreign ports. It was now a force unseen, relentless, and terrifying, moving across Europe with the persistence of weather. But unlike a storm, it gave no warning. There was no thunder, no darkening sky, just silence, then sickness, then death. Europe was unprepared. Medieval cities were not designed with sanitation in mind. Streets were narrow and clogged with refuse. Human and animal waste often mixed in open ditches. Livestock roamed freely. Houses were crowded, often with entire families living under one roof. Clean water was unreliable. Rats were everywhere, and no one, neither the poor nor the wealthy, understood how the disease truly spread. By the spring of 1348, the plague had settled into its grim rhythm. It arrived in a town like a rumor. First, a traveler fell ill, then a baker's boy, then half the parish. The symptoms were unmistakable and unlike anything most had ever seen. Swellings, often dark or purple, appeared in the armpit or groin. These buboes, as they came to be called, were excruciatingly painful and were often followed by fever, vomiting, delirium, and death. In some variations, now known as pneumonic or septicemic plague, victims died without buboes, sometimes in a single day. Once the disease took hold in a city, it spread with frightening speed. Hospitals were few. The concept of organized public health was virtually non-existent. Some cities, such as Venice and Dubrovnik, tried to isolate ships and visitors, a policy that would later evolve into quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. But for the most part, towns and villages were left to fend for themselves. In many places, civil order collapsed. In Florence, the chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio described scenes that became typical across Europe. Families abandoned sick relatives. Parents left infected children. Corpses were dragged into the streets or piled into mass graves, often buried without ceremony. Priests and doctors, already few in number, were overwhelmed or fled. Those who stayed often died soon after. In cities like Avignon, the seat of the papacy, conditions were no better. It's said that in the height of the plague, Pope Clement VI was forced to consecrate the Rhone River so that the dead could be thrown into it when cemeteries became too full. The papal court burned bonfires around the Pope's chambers to purify the air, a practice based on the belief that the sickness was caused by miasma, or bad air. The silence of the plague was not only physical, it was social, psychological, spiritual. People stopped talking to each other in the streets. Town criers no longer announced the day's events. Church bells tolled constantly, not to mark the hours, but to signal the dead. Monasteries emptied, markets closed. The rhythm of daily life, once measured by plows and prayers, was replaced by uncertainty and fear. Many turned to religion for answers. Public processions of Flagellants emerged across Europe. These were groups of men who marched from town to town, stripped to the waist and whipping themselves in penance for the sins of humankind. They believed the plague was God's punishment and that self-mortification might mitigate the divine wrath. The Church, fearing their extremism, eventually condemned the movement. Others turned on their neighbors. In Germany and other areas, rumors spread that Jewish communities had poisoned the wells or conspired to spread the plague. These unfounded accusations sparked a wave of violence in cities like Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz. Entire Jewish communities were annihilated or expelled. These events, now understood as some of the worst anti-Jewish pogroms of the Middle Ages, were driven by panic, scapegoating, and a desperate human need to assign blame. The countryside was no safer. Villages emptied overnight. Fields were left untended. Livestock roamed freely or starved. In some areas, up to half the population died within a few months.
While the plague is most famous for the devastation in Europe, its roots and reach were far wider. Long before it arrived in Messina or Paris, the disease had already cut a grim path across Asia. The Middle East and North Africa, civilizations centuries old, were brought to their knees not by war or invasion, but by something much smaller. The Black Death is believed to have originated in the steppes of Central Asia, likely modern Kyrgyzstan. In 2011, scientists traced the genetic markers of the bacterium Yersinia pestis to Lake Issyk-Kul, a region that was, at the time, part of the complex trade network linked to the Mongol Empire. Archaeological evidence even includes gravestones dating to the 1330s with inscriptions of sudden mass death, possibly marking one of the first major outbreaks. From there, the disease likely spread along the Silk Road. By the mid-1340s, the plague reached Samarkand, Tashkent, and other caravan cities. Merchants, soldiers, and nomads were constantly moving, and the Mongol Empire, known for creating relatively safe trade zones, Pax Mongolica, may have unintentionally accelerated the spread. Ironically, the very conditions that fostered prosperity, open roads, safe travel, bustling markets, now enabled the catastrophe. From Central Asia, the plague traveled southwest into Persia, modern Iran. The noted scholar Ibn al-Wardi, writing from Aleppo in 1348, claimed the disease devastated vast territories. He noted that in Trebizond and Tbilisi, entire communities were depopulated. Persian chronicles mention a pestilence so swift that no one could bury the dead. Meanwhile, the plague entered the Middle East via trade routes connecting cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Aleppo with the Mediterranean. Baghdad, already suffering decline after the Mongol sack of 1258, only deepened its wounds. By 1347, the plague reached Damascus, one of the most densely populated and cosmopolitan cities in the Islamic world. The historian Ibn Battuta, who visited the city shortly after the outbreak, recorded that at the plague's peak, more than 2,000 people died daily. Mosques were crowded with funeral prayers. The streets fell silent. The Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Egypt and much of the Levant, decreed public fasts and religious processions. Scholars debated whether the plague was a punishment or a trial. People found solace in faith and in flight. Further west, the plague reached Cairo, then the thriving capital of the Mamluk Sultanate and one of the world's wealthiest cities, with a population possibly exceeding 500,000. When the plague arrived in 1349, it swept through the population with terrifying speed. Contemporary accounts estimate that Cairo lost up to 200,000 people within a few months. Eyewitnesses describe corpses piling up faster than they could be buried. The prominent Egyptian historian al-Makrizi wrote, "Funeral pits were dug by day and night, and still they could not keep up. Markets closed, schools emptied, and entire districts fell silent." Across the Mediterranean, the disease skipped to North Africa. It struck Tunis, Algiers, and Fez, devastating port cities and inland settlements. In the Islamic world, the response to the plague was shaped by theology and legal tradition. While some scholars viewed it as divine punishment, others interpreted it as a test of patience and submission to God. A famous saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that one should neither enter nor flee a land where the plague is present shaped public behavior. In some cases, people stayed in affected cities despite the risk, believing that to do otherwise was to defy God's will. Interestingly, the Islamic world did not engage in the same degree of minority scapegoating as Europe. Jewish communities in Cairo and Damascus, for instance, did not face the pogroms that swept the Holy Roman Empire. The reaction, though steeped in spiritual interpretation,
was often more organized and less hysterical than in parts of Europe. Even far to the east, in India and parts of China, records suggest the presence of plague outbreaks, though details are scarce. The Yuan Dynasty in China faced mass mortality in the 1330s. By the time the plague reached Europe, it was not a new crisis, it was simply Europe's turn. Millions had already died in cities and deserts most Europeans had never heard of. The disease had moved from the foot of the Himalayas to the Nile Delta, across mountains, oceans, steppes, and sand. It touched caliphates, khanates, sultanates, and was now moving west toward the cathedrals and castles of the Christian world. And always it traveled on the wind, on a merchant's breath, a sailor's sleeve, a flea's bite, whispering across borders long before anyone knew they were open. From the moment the Genoese ships docked in Messina in October 1347, the plague began its march across the continent. It spread with frightening speed. Within months, it reached Marseille and Genoa. By early 1348, it penetrated the heart of France and the trading cities of northern Italy, Florence, Pisa, and Venice. The disease moved inland with caravans along the Roman roads and up the rivers. Florence lost perhaps 50,000 of its 100,000 citizens. Paris buried thousands in mass graves outside the city walls. In London, entire parishes disappeared. In the countryside, some villages vanished completely, fields left untended, houses rotting back into the earth. They would be called lost villages for centuries. The social consequences were immediate and strange. With the death of thousands of laborers, wages soared. Some surviving peasants, once tied to the land, began to demand pay. The foundations of feudalism shook. Nobles attempted to enforce the old laws. Beneath the surface, revolts brewed. Religion was rocked. Many clergy died serving the sick, and with them, trust in the church weakened. Some became more devout, others turned away entirely. The world had changed, and not everyone believed it would ever return to what it was. The plague, having no mind or mercy, continued until it had touched nearly all of Europe. By the time it subsided, around 1352, an estimated 30% to 60% of the continent's population had died. But the echo of that time, the empty fields, the silent cities, and the grieving settlements would resonate across Europe for generations. What distinguished the Black Death from other diseases of the time was not only the stunning death toll, but the nature of the disease itself. It struck suddenly, progressed swiftly, and manifested in symptoms that were terrifying, unmistakable, and, to the people of the 14th century, inexplicable. Today we understand that the Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It is most often transmitted by fleas that feed on infected rodents, particularly the black rat, which was common in medieval cities and on ships. However, at the time, there was no concept of bacteria or infection in the modern sense. Historical records identify three main forms of the plague during the 14th century pandemic: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, each manifested with its own set of symptoms and speed of onset. Bubonic plague. This was the most common form. The first signs appeared within 2 to 6 days. Victims felt feverish and fatigued. The distinguishing symptom was the formation of buboes, swollen, inflamed lymph nodes, most commonly in the groin, armpits, or neck. They could grow to the size of an egg or an apple, often darkening to a deep purple or black. They were agonizingly painful and often burst. The mortality rate was between 60 and 70%. Most victims died within a week. Pneumonic plague. This form was significantly more dangerous because of its transmission method. Unlike bubonic plague, pneumonic plague was airborne. It occurred when the bacteria infected the lungs, primary pneumonic plague, or as a complication of untreated bubonic plague, secondary. Symptoms included severe chest pain, difficulty breathing, bloody or frothy coughing, and rapid respiratory failure. This form could spread by coughing or sneezing, making it contagious in a way that terrified medieval observers. Pneumonic plague had a shorter incubation period, often only 1 to 3 days, and could kill within 24 to 48 hours. Because of its rapid progression and ease of transmission, pneumonic plague was responsible for many high-mortality outbreaks in dense urban areas. Septicemic plague. This form was the rarest but the most deadly. Septicemic plague occurred when the infection entered the bloodstream directly, bypassing the lymphatic system or the lungs. Symptoms included sudden onset of fever and chills, rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure, bleeding under the skin, and the darkening of fingers, toes, and the nose due to blood clotting and tissue death. The skin could turn black, particularly on the extremities, a detail some scholars believe contributed to the name Black Death. Septicemic plague often killed its victims within hours, sometimes before any external signs fully developed. Mortality approached 100% without treatment. For the people of the Middle Ages, the symptoms of the plague were both a physical and spiritual horror. The black swellings, the stench of infected bodies, and the rapid deaths defied comprehension. Medical knowledge was based on Galenic theory, which emphasized the imbalance of bodily humors. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the use of aromatic herbs to purify the air. Some physicians wore beak-like masks filled with spices, believing this would protect them from miasma or the bad air. Others turned to more mystical remedies, burning sulfur, wearing amulets, or resorting to flagellation to atone for imagined sins. Chroniclers describe streets littered with bodies, homes sealed from the outside, and a silence broken only by coughing and wails. Beyond the physical suffering, the plague symptoms created a deep emotional and cultural trauma. Families were often struck down all at once. The visibility of the disease, the buboes, the blackened skin, the sudden collapse, created an atmosphere of fear and helplessness. There was no cure. There was no explanation that satisfied. In the years the Black Death moved like a shadow across the continents, faith and fear became inseparable. God was sought in whispers, in chants, in processions, and when the answers didn't come, people created their own. The 14th century was a profoundly religious time. In Europe, the Catholic Church was the foundation of social order. Most people believed without question that the events of the world were governed by divine will. Sickness, therefore, could only be understood as a punishment or a test. In God's universe, there were no accidents. As the plague spread, churches filled with terrified parishioners. Priests read aloud Psalm 91, which was believed to offer protection from pestilence. But many clergy died quickly. Entire monasteries were wiped out. In some places, the clergy ranks were so depleted that priests were ordained after only a few days of training. As the usual channels of religious comfort collapsed, people sought new or darker ones. In Germany, the Flagellant movement surged in popularity. These were groups of penitents who believed the plague was divine punishment for the sins of humanity. Groups of men marched barefoot through towns and villages, whipping themselves with metal-tipped scourges, chanting hymns, and praying for forgiveness. The spectacle mingled with desperation. Initially, many flagellants were welcomed with the hope that their devotion might appease God, but their message grew increasingly apocalyptic. They claimed the church had become corrupt. It was then that fear turned to blame. Across Central and Western Europe, Jewish communities became the target of increasingly violent accusations. It was claimed that Jews had poisoned the wells, conspired, or invoked sorcery. There was no truth to this, but truth didn't matter. In Strasbourg, in 1349, over 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day. In Basel, the entire Jewish population was expelled. Similar massacres followed in dozens of towns from the Rhineland to Spain. Sometimes the accusations came from panicking villagers.
Other times they were fueled by city leaders hoping to cancel debts owed to Jewish lenders. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, issued papal bulls condemning these actions, stating that the plague was a punishment from God, not the result of a human plot. But papal authority meant little when fear reigned. In the Islamic world, the reaction had a different tone. The plague was also understood in religious terms, but there was less focus on blame. According to Islamic teaching, plague was a martyrdom for believers and a trial from God, something to be endured with patience. As a result, many Muslim communities focused not on flight, but on maintaining social order and prayer. In Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo, public fasts and supplications were held. The historian Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who survived the plague in Cairo, lost several of his own children but continued to write and keep records. His spiritual discipline was evident. Yet, amidst the horror and the loss, some found ways to hope. Mystical movements thrived. Christian mystics spoke of visions of angels weeping over Europe. New saints were revered. Art began to reflect the scale of the suffering. Skeletons danced in frescoes. Time and death became the subject of poetry. It was the birth of the memento mori tradition, remember death, not as a scare tactic, but as a way to live honestly. In Florence, Paris, and London, surviving clergy attempted to rebuild their communities. The village priests, often the last figures of leadership, stayed, buried the dead, comforted the sick, and held to the ritual, even if no one was left to attend. Some believed the world was ending. Others believed it had already ended. Yet the fields still needed plowing. Children were still born. The bells still tolled. The fear would never fully disappear, but neither would the faith. And somewhere in the quiet spaces the plague left behind, in the empty chapels, the burned synagogues, the purged courtyards where the Flagellants once bled, the idea of a different world began to take root. A world with new questions, a world with fewer certainties, but a world that somehow kept moving forward. When the Black Death loosened its grip on Europe around 1352, it did not announce its departure. There were no celebrations, no feasting, no sense of victory. It left slowly, tentatively, and in many places only temporarily. What it left behind was not merely loss, it was change. Deep, structural shifts that no one had planned and no one would forget. Across Europe, the numbers told the story. Some cities lost half their population. Entire villages disappeared, swallowed by weeds and silence. In England, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population died. In parts of Italy, the figure could be higher. The dead were not just numbers. They were laborers, priests, mothers, judges, scholars, children. Their absence was everywhere. And yet, where one order collapses, something new always rises. In the years before the plague, most peasants were tied to the land through feudal obligations. But when entire villages emptied and harvests went uncollected, landowners found themselves desperately short of labor. This desperation shifted the balance of power. Peasants began to demand wages, better conditions, and the freedom to move to cities or to other lords who offered more. In some cases, they simply abandoned their obligations. The old system of serfdom, already weakened by decades of economic stress, began to fracture. Landowners resisted. Laws were passed to freeze wages and limit movement, notably the Statute of Laborers in England in 1351. But enforcement proved difficult when half your workforce had vanished. For the first time in centuries, labor had leverage. The economic shock created unexpected winners. Merchants, skilled artisans, and surviving landowners who could adapt found new opportunities. With less competition and rising wages, some former peasants began to move up the social ladder. Land became available. Inheritance became more likely. A small but growing middle class began to form, especially in the towns. At the same time, the nobility struggled. Their income, tied to agricultural rents and fixed payments, plummeted. Some were forced to sell land or marry into wealthier commoner families. The hierarchy of the medieval world began to shift. The church suffered terribly during the plague. Many of its most devoted members, priests, monks, and nuns, died serving the sick. Others fled, leaving parishes rudderless. In the aftermath, the church faced growing criticism and a decline in moral authority. With so many clerical vacancies, the church had to ordain new priests quickly, often with minimal education. This led to complaints of corruption, ignorance, and a growing distance between church doctrine and the everyday struggles of the laity. Though most people remained profoundly religious, trust in institutional authority weakened. This erosion would quietly contribute to later movements, such as the Lollards in England, and, eventually, the Protestant Reformation a century later. Perhaps the most surprising legacy of the Black Death was not death at all, but rebirth. In Italy, which suffered some of the worst mortality rates, something remarkable began to happen afterward. With old structures shattered, wealth redistributed, and the cultural shock of mortality in every mind, people began to think differently about life, art, and the human experience itself. Florence, devastated by the plague, became the cradle of the Renaissance. Survivors commissioned frescoes, funded universities, and began to celebrate individual achievement. Art became more personal, more emotional. Literature shifted toward realism, satire, and philosophy. In the decades following the plague, Petrarch wrote of longing and memory. Boccaccio, having survived the plague in Florence, wrote the Decameron, a collection of human stories told by people hiding from death. Their works were not just about beauty, they were about what it means to survive. Across Europe, languages changed. Latin, long the language of the elite, began to cede more ground to vernacular writing in English, French, Italian, and German. The voice of the common person was rising. Even science took cautious steps forward. While many physicians failed to cure the plague, a small number of thinkers began to question ancient medical theories. They began to compile case histories, observe symptoms more closely, and challenge the idea that sickness was purely divine punishment. The seeds of medical empiricism and ultimately modern science were quietly sown. Legacy and the birth of public health. The Black Death never entirely vanished. It returned in waves for the next 4 centuries, though never again with the same ferocity. But its first sweep permanently changed the fabric of life. It changed who owned the land, who worked it, who prayed, and how. Perhaps the most direct and long-lasting legacy of the Black Death is how societies began to think about disease itself. For the first time, cities across Europe began to recognize the need for organized civic responses to sickness. In Venice, one of the most heavily impacted cities and a hub of maritime trade, officials began introducing quarantine regulations as early as 1377. Arriving ships suspected of carrying the disease were ordered to wait 40 days before unloading, hence the word quarantine from the Italian quaranta giorni. Guards were posted at the city gates. Sanitary commissions were established to oversee public health. In the following decades, these practices spread, laying the foundation for modern public health infrastructure. In time, this new approach evolved into the building of lazarettos, isolation hospitals, often on islands where the sick were kept separate from the healthy. Venice built the first in 1423. These were imperfect but revolutionary measures. For the first time in European history, disease was viewed as a common problem requiring collective civic action. The demographic collapse of the Black Death redrew the physical map of Europe. With so many dead, cities shrank not only in population but in area. Entire districts were abandoned.
Villages disappeared completely. In England alone, over 1,000 villages vanished. Fields lay fallow. Forests grew back where farmland had once stretched. Some towns were rebuilt on a smaller scale. Others reimagined their layout, widening streets, improving drainage, and reviewing access to clean water. The architecture of the post-plague world subtly changed. Fewer grand cathedrals were started, and more private chapels, secular halls, and civic buildings appeared. The trauma of the Black Death spurred an explosion of creativity, introspection, and innovation. In literature, the plague inspired some of the first modern narrative structures. In Boccaccio's Decameron, young people escaped to entertain each other with stories. The framework of the narrative, a world in crisis, people seeking meaning through storytelling, would be copied for centuries. In art, the plague introduced a new visual language, the danse macabre, or dance of death. This motif showed skeletons leading the living, kings, bishops, peasants, to the grave, emphasizing the all-encompassing reach of mortality. Religious dissenters grew louder. Movements like the Lollards in England questioned the authority of the Church and its failure to explain the suffering. These seeds of discontent would flower in the 16th century Protestant Reformation. For physicians, the Black Death was a crisis of both theory and practice. Medieval medicine failed spectacularly. In the decades after the plague, medical writers began to change course. They described symptoms meticulously, recorded patterns of transmission, and discussed environmental factors. This wasn't yet the scientific method, but it was a retreat from blind faith in ancient texts. The most enduring legacy of the Black Death is memory, and how we talk about disease, how we prepare, and how we grieve. In 2020, when a new pandemic swept the globe, comparisons to the Black Death quickly surfaced. People rediscovered Boccaccio. Social media revived 14th century imagery, not because we expected the same scale, but because the questions about fear, blame, resilience, and survival remain the same. In the darkest years of the plague, it felt as though the world might end, but it didn't. The candle flickered, but did not go out.